It's really lovely to be here today. It's a great honour, and particularly in such wonderful surroundings. I know a year ago, Rob Thompson stood in a similar position and he expressed the view that he'd made the big time. And a year on, I can only echo that sentiment, but far more so, and ponder a little bit on what I'm doing here. But here I am. Woman talking about women. And I know that that's not everybody's idea of Great War sort of speaker heaven. I do hope I can rustle up some enthusiasm today in the room for women, and these women in particular. My talk's about VADs, members of Voluntary Aid Detachments, those women who worked as nursing assistants supporting the Army nursing services during wartime. Almost every sick and wounded soldier who was admitted to hospital would have come across one, so they were a real part of many soldiers' lives. I want to try and do two things today. Firstly, to give you some facts, some hard facts about the organisation, the history of the movement. Secondly, and I think more importantly, in such a very short time, with the help of some images and words of the women themselves, I want to try and let you eavesdrop, to drop you in on their lives, to get a sense of their lives and awareness of what sort of women they are, what sort of women they were, and what their life was like in wartime. But to start, I'm going back a long way before the Great War. There'd been concern ever since 1902 and the end of the war in South Africa that in the case of another war, the medical services, the Army's medical services would be found wanting. There was always a fundamental problem that the peacetime needs of an army in relation to medical care was small and very specific. To find thousands of trained and experienced personnel without the cost of maintaining them in peacetime was a hard problem to overcome. R.B. Haldane's territorial scheme of 1907 solved some of those problems, and it opened up new possibilities of cooperation between voluntary agencies and the Army. And on the 16th of August 1909, the War Office issued a scheme for the organisation of voluntary aid in England and Wales, which set up both male and female voluntary aid detachments to fill certain gaps in the territorial medical services, with a similar scheme for Scotland starting in December of that year. It was a popular movement, and by early 1914, more than 1,700 female detachments, more than 500 male detachments had been registered with the War Office. With apologies to men, both past and present, today I'm just going to concentrate on the women who joined and went to war. Just general image that doesn't say a lot, but female detachments varied in size depending on their circumstances, but on paper they consisted of a commandant, a medical officer, a quartermaster, and 22 women. Among those 22 women, there was supposed to be 1 or 2 trained nurses. Finding even one trained nurse in many rural areas was difficult. Some didn't have that trained nurse alongside. Women had to study for certificates in first aid and home nursing within a year of joining, and pre-war the detachments varied greatly in how seriously they took their responsibilities. Some were ill-equipped, poorly managed and staffed, and put in only a minimum of effort to meet the standards required by the territorial county associations, while others were intent on being as prepared as possible for a role that they might never be called upon to fulfill. The detachments were intended for home service only, to staff auxiliary hospitals and rest stations, and the members received no payment or salary for their duties. Voluntary was the vital word. As we see later, some of those women were paid for their work during the Great War, but the women who joined would all have been in a position, at least initially, to give their services free. That often meant to be in a social position to give their services free. Pre-war, they liked to have fun. They liked lots of get-togethers. This is Voluntary Aid Detachments being presented to the Duchess of Norfolk at Arundel Castle in 1912. There's a female detachment, a male detachment alongside. And these women, 2 rows of them, and their officers, not very clear on the side, would probably have been the entire staff of that particular detachment. They like to have competitions, stretcher practice, splinting legs, bandaging competitions. Many things that they were never actually called upon to do in wartime, but no one was to know that then, and their get-togethers were often very social. They liked very large get-togethers. This one, many detachments having a meal probably following one of these camps they went to. And the women who joined detachments were a mixture. They were a wide range of ages with different sorts of life skills. As a group, they were very much defined by being middle or upper middle class. They were the daughters of local gentry, landowners, army officers, clergy, professional men, and also included a large number of women with an aristocratic background. The majority were young women who had never had any paid employment, and of those who eventually went on to wartime service, 3/4 of them had never worked outside the home before. Generally speaking, women of their class were not expected to work. They moved from their home, their parents' home, into marriage and running a home of their own, and if they remained single, they may well have stayed at home and eventually have taken responsibility for the care of their elderly parents. One VAD, the daughter of a Yorkshire lawyer, explained, "We lived very comfortably with lots of servants, so there was no real work to do. We tidied our rooms, we paid calls, we had tea parties, we sewed, we taught at Sunday school. We organised bazaars and fêtes and made sweets and cakes for them. We always seemed to be busy." And I'm sure she was quite typical. Irene Rathbone wrote an autobiographical novel about her life and war service, a book called We That Were Young. And in the introduction to that book, Elizabeth Delafield wrote in 1931, "To the very great number of middle and upper middle class young women, myself among them, the war brought release. We'd been brought up in the tradition that a girl did not work. She was worked for by a male relation, usually her father. Her aim in life was to find another man who would take upon himself this obligation by marrying her. In return, she became his housekeeper, the mother of his children. Women who were girls in 1914 will understand what that meant. Those who are girls in 1931 will not, never can." And that's a quote that shows how much women's status had changed and moved on by 1931 into a totally different generation. But pre-war, home life, particularly in rural areas, must have been stifling for intelligent young women, and the chance to get away, if only for a few hours a week, make new friends, acquire new skills, would have been a real attraction. And this new interest was often found acceptable by their parents, as they considered the knowledge their daughters gained would serve them well in their future lives. To know the basics of home nursing, first aid and invalid cookery would always be useful for a well-rounded wife and mother. I doubt if these women ever thought in 1909 that within a very short time they'd be involved in things that very few women had ever experienced before, and not many ever would again. They were on the brink of something quite unique. When war came, The Red Cross and auxiliary hospitals, for which detailed plans had already been made over the preceding years, sprung up rapidly in church halls, public buildings and private houses, accommodating anything from 10 patients to more than 100. The variety was enormous, and just to have a look at some of those hospitals and different types, this first image is a very tiny hospital at Shepworth Village Hall in Cambridgeshire, who took 21 patients, other ranks. It's quite an interesting image taken very early in the war, and it shows an enormous variety of beds. It shows wrought iron beds, very plain beds, wooden beds, fancy beds, and all that equipment would have been promised by local people. They would have been asked before the war whether they could make donations if they were ever needed, and as soon as war was declared and the hospitals were mobilized, then there would have been a great rush for the local people to bring in equipment to staff these very small hospitals. I have got hard copies of all these images with me today if anyone wants a closer look, a more detailed look at them afterwards. But most of the equipment in the tiny hospitals would have been donated. The next one, private house. This is Paddington VAD Hospital, 37 Porchester Terrace, Kensington, a much larger building, very grand building. 2 VADs, 3 VADs, many soldiers there. And this was larger. This took 65 convalescent men. London was full of private houses which were used as hospitals. The majority of them for officers, this one for other ranks. And an example of a public building, this is Farringdon VAD Hospital in Swindon. Opened in Farringdon Street baths early in the war. The baths boarded over. You have to wonder at what was actually going on underneath those boards. Very large, took 80 other ranks in one large building. I don't know what all these VADs are doing around. I'm sure they wouldn't all have been on duty at one time. Presumably, a lot of them came specially to have their photo taken. The hospital wasn't open for very long, a year or so, because it had a glass and metal roof, which was lovely if you were bathing, but not so good for a hospital. And many of the men in these hospitals were the less seriously wounded and convalescents transferred from larger military hospitals. And the proportion of trained nurses in the units was small. Much of the basic work was the responsibility of the VADs, who cleaned, scrubbed, dusted, set trays, cooked breakfasts. They lit fires, they boiled up coppers full of washing, and these were things many of them had never seen before, let alone taken part in. Gladys Stanford was a VAD in Dorset. She had a particular problem with fires. She writes, "There were coal fires in little wards that only held 4 or 5 patients, and we had to take it in turns to do the housework. Every morning we had to light these dreadful fires. They had old-fashioned grates, and it was so difficult. I never mastered it because I'd never had to light a fire in my life. But I did learn one trick that used to work. I'd do my best to get it going, which wasn't very good. And when I saw that it was going to go out at any minute, if there was a man who could get out of bed, I used to say, 'Oh dear, I must go. Will you keep an eye on the fire for me?' I knew perfectly well that it was going to go out at any moment, and the poor man would have to light it all over again. But the men never minded, and they were much better at making them burn than we were." The VADs also helped to dress, undress and wash the men. This was a step quite far for young women who may never have been alone and unchaperoned with a member of the opposite sex before, other than their brothers. But their strong sense of patriotism, the need to help the war effort, gave them the maturity and the common sense to succeed in many areas that would have been completely taboo before the war. During wartime, the VAD organisation was administered by the Joint War Committee, a wartime amalgamation of the British Red Cross Society and the Order of St John, and it was run from Devonshire House in Piccadilly, which had been loaned for the war by the Duke and Duchess of Devonshire. Its palatial rooms became a maze of offices that dealt with recruiting, training, managing the staff of hundreds of VAD and auxiliary hospitals at home, and sending staff to hospitals overseas. Quite hard to imagine what was going on in Devonshire House at that time. One of London's great houses, demolished in 1924, and one painting left behind, and I'm sorry, this just doesn't show up really well. Again, I have got a hard copy of it. This is the interior of Devonshire House during the war, a painting at the Imperial War Museum by Claire Atwood. It's got an amazing ceiling on it, and chandeliers wrapped in sheets to protect them, and down either side of the room, double rows of card indexes. And those card indexes were their computers of the time, card indexes for the staff, card indexes for the stores, for the hospitals. The surviving cards of the staff index survived, and they're now at the British Red Cross archives in Moorfields in London. So there is one for almost every VAD who served, and they will look up the cards and the details. To try and quote statistics and numbers is very hard, as every source suggests a different figure. There were about 50,000 women involved in the VAD movement immediately before the war. About 10,000 VADs served overseas in hospitals under the direction of the War Office. And it's thought that at least 100,000 women served as VADs at some time during the war, most of them unpaid. If the war had been a short one and a small one, perhaps the military nursing services would have managed without additional help, but by early 1915 it was already evident that there were not enough trained nurses to keep the military hospitals staffed. And the War Office agreed that VADs could be employed in military hospitals at home to augment the trained staff in the spring of 1915. By early summer of that year, they went overseas as well. It was not a universally popular move, with much wariness and mistrust on behalf of the trained nursing staff. But the meeting and the mixing of the two groups was inevitable. Many trained nurses did not want to work alongside the amateur nurse in wartime. There was a feeling among them that patriotism was no substitute for professionalism, and they made life difficult for the VAD. Although, on the other hand, there were VADs who were in no way suited to nursing, some who wanted what they saw as the status, the glory of war work, but had no aptitude for practical work. And that's not surprising. They could not all have had that aptitude. Some VADs were so entrenched in middle-class society, they had so much inbred confidence in their position, they considered social status continued to outweigh professional qualifications. They came from backgrounds that encouraged a confident and outgoing nature. They were not necessarily cowed into submissiveness by the army machine. One of those, Helen Beale, was brought up at Standon, a large country house in mid-Sussex, and she first joined as a VAD in 1911. In one letter home from France during wartime, she described the fully trained nursing sister on her ward as a lively and cheerful little article, perhaps somewhat du peuple, but that is no harm. Bonhomie and good temper are much more important than anything else out here. And her mother replied, I'd like to have the chance of telling her what's what, how thankful she ought to be and how privileged to have you to help her. And Enid Bagnold, who was later famous for writing the book National Velvet, worked as a VAD at the Royal Herbert Hospital near her home in Woolwich. While there, she wrote a wonderfully perceptive account of the hospital, a book called A Diary Without Dates. But it was so critical of the nursing hierarchy and the hospital administration that she was dismissed very shortly after its publication. I feel quite torn. She is vicious in her criticism of the trained nurse, but it is a book very elegantly written and an excellent account of a large military hospital during the war. From her book, an example that illustrates the antipathy between the VAD and the professional nursing sisters. She writes many of them. Half the book is devoted to these sort of quotes. The sister on her ward has just left, one of the few sisters, nursing sisters she got on with, and the new sister has come. And she writes, "The new sister has come. She has a medal. That should mean a lot. The new sister has come, and at present she is absolutely without personality. Beyond her medal, she appears to be deaf. A sister has an intimate life. It occurs when she goes off duty, that is to say, it lies between 8:45 when she finishes her supper and 10 o'clock when she finishes undressing. That is why one sister said to me, 'If I hadn't taken up nursing, I should have gone in for culture.' I don't laugh at that. To have an intimate life, one must have a little time, and who am I to step in from outside and criticize? The hospital is not my life. I am expecting more." And VADs as a group did expect far more than what they saw as the lot of the trained nurse. For employment in military hospitals under the authority of the War Office, nursing VADs had usually worked an initial few months or so in an auxiliary hospital under the Joint War Committee. In those hospitals, they didn't get paid, although if living away from home, they would get board and lodging provided. On transfer to hospitals under War Office control, they were initially paid £20 a year, with allowances for uniform, board, lodging, laundry, fuel, light, further amounts if serving overseas. And in total, these could add up to at least £115 a year in payment or in kind. But the vast majority of women who served as VADs during the Great War weren't working in these military hospitals. They were in the smaller auxiliary units, and therefore the whole of their service was unpaid. It's also true that many of them didn't work throughout the war. Some left after just a few weeks or a few months. But to work for nothing for up to 4 or 5 years, which many did, was certainly a gift to the nation. Standards in military hospitals were rigorously adhered to, and VADs were left in no doubt as to what was expected of them, or perhaps what was not expected of them. One of them recalled, "Every morning we reported to matron for uniform inspection and orders, including which was how to behave on the wards, no showing of ankles. Black shoes and stockings, spotless apron, collar, cuffs and cap, and on no account be familiar with a patient. Treat them well, look after them well, but eyes down and remember, they have womenfolk of their own." VADs sometimes considered that they were treated as little more than domestic staff and given very little responsibility. But nursing had always been an onerous and difficult life. In the normal way, when a girl entered nurse training, she was well aware of what lay ahead, particularly in the early days. Most VADs had never intended to become nurses before the war. Some weren't prepared for the repetitive, mundane work, the discipline, the petty rules which abounded in hospitals. Neither were they, for the most part, women who were used to taking orders from others, and some found it very difficult for the mistress and servant role to be reversed, and they saw their treatment as bullying, although they were being treated no differently from the average student nurse of the time. In 1916, some humorous rules for VADs appeared in the magazine of No. 1 Eastern General Hospital, Cambridge, the first of which rather aptly read, "The mind should be a receptive blank until something is required, at which point an intelligent grasp of the subject should be immediately shown. Do not let it distress you that it is impossible to be both as ignorant and as intelligent as is expected of you." Considering the number of VADs employed, it's not surprising that there were many complaints. There were quite a number about the meanness of the allowances, not being able to claim travelling expenses when attending an initial interview or going home on leave. In a letter to Devonshire House, one VAD wrote, "Even Dartmoor shirkers travel free, while we, who are serving king and country, cannot get any privileges." And it was this lack of privileges that was a thread running through VAD life in the UK, and eventually in 1918 led to large divisions at the top of the organisation. Another VAD, although she liked her work, could stay no longer at Queen Mary's Hospital in Whalley, Lancashire, as she felt the men there were far too free-making, and she was the subject of constant unwelcome attention. I think the surprise there is that more women didn't feel the same, and most of them coped admirably with very new and unusual situations. In all areas, women were expected to see things and do things that they had never been expected to confront before, things which few people would ever be expected to confront even once in their lifetime, let alone on a daily basis. In the beginning, they cleaned and scrubbed, they set trays, they boiled eggs, and later moved on to help the trained nurses with dressings and treatments, viewing every bodily cavity never designed to be viewed from the outside. They learned to smile and accept mutilated faces without flinching or turning away. They learned to breathe through their mouths during the dressing round to prevent the stench of gangrenous limbs overwhelming them. And often they did all that for no monetary reward. Their reward was knowing that they were serving their country as their brothers, their fathers, their friends were serving theirs. They considered it both their wish and their duty. After 6 months' work in a home hospital, if a woman's work and conduct was deemed suitable, she could apply for overseas service. Despite the popular image of VADs as being very young, for overseas service they had to be between 23 and 42 years of age. There were many mature and married women among them, and the majority of them served in British hospitals, in Malta, Serbia, Salonika, Egypt, in France, of course, and on board hospital ships. They signed a contract with the War Office for 6 months at a time, and before embarking, they were given a message written by Catherine Furse, their Commandant-in-Chief, which started, "You are being sent to work for the Red Cross. You have to perform a task which will need your courage, your energy, your patience, your humility, your determination to overcome all difficulties. Remember that the honour of the VAD organisation depends on your individual conduct." And echoing the similar soldier's message, it ended, "Do your duty loyally, fear God, honour the King." Duty, God and the King, three things which were so important then and supplied the only reason most women needed for undertaking wartime service. This image of VADs arriving in Boulogne, like so many of the official photos taken, this was taken after the Armistice. So these women were not there for the first time. These were not new VADs going out, that I can't produce. But it does give at least some idea of VADs out of uniform, just travelling in the normal way as they would have been seen, and everybody would have been used to seeing them at that time. and in a way that we're not so used to seeing them now, coming off of a leave ship at Boulogne. Although there were complaints of being underemployed in some home hospitals, that was something rarely levelled at military hospitals overseas due to the lack of trained nurses who became increasingly thinly spread over more and more hospitals. The proportion of VADs grew larger, the work assigned to them more responsible. Contrary to popular belief, VADs never served in any frontline units abroad, not in casualty clearing stations or field ambulances. And they worked almost entirely in the large general hospitals in the base towns, such as Rouen, Étampes, Boulogne, Le Tréport. Some VADs worked in France, but they remained in the service of the Joint War Committee, and they staffed British Red Cross and St John's hospitals, and also worked in canteens and rest stations, nurses' clubs, soldiers' recreation centres, and sick bays for the Women's Army. To look at a few of those, this is the British Red Cross Soldiers' Recreation Hut in Wimereux, run by VADs, 3 of them here, who would have dealt with providing food, running a library, making sure men had note paper to write letters. They would have been helped by 1 or 2 male orderlies to do the heavy work. These women under the Joint War Committee would have got board and lodging allowance, but would have had no salary for the work they did, either at home or abroad. And this is another Joint War Committee little hospital, a funny little hospital. This is the detention hospital at Gournay-en-Bray. Detention hospital always rather conjures up men being imprisoned, but it was nothing like that. There were 2 of these little hospitals, one at Gournay, east of Rouen, and another one similar at Forges-les-Eaux, just a little bit further north. And they were run specially for men who didn't really need hospital treatment, but just needed a week or 2 to recover. They were set up for special reasons. This one, to look after men from 2 veterinary hospitals and 2 remount depots. So men who were frequently having falls, kicks, just injuries from the animals. And again, staffed by trained nurses here and a VAD in Joint War Committee control, so again, not being paid for their work. And the next one, from this very tiny hospital to a very much larger hospital, and this is the inside of number 14 General Hospital Wimereux, the casino. It was a very grand room before. It's got a stage at the end, men on every level down all sides and in the centre of the room. And this taken in the summer of 1915, a group of VADs in the middle, and those VADs would have been some of the first to go out to France to staff British military hospitals. So these women would have been very new. They would have come from much smaller hospitals at home and been transported into this very different, massive world of a fairly large British military hospital. 14 General was running right from almost the outbreak of war, right until the middle of 1919. Of all the published accounts written by women who served as nurses during the Great War, most were written by VADs. And in one, Olive Dent describes her arrival at number 9 General Hospital, which was on the racecourse at Rouen in the winter of 1916. We were taken to the night duty room, and in about 3 minutes we were wondering why on earth we were so consummately foolish as to volunteer for nursing service. It was 2:30 in the morning. We were most impolitely hungry and could cheerfully have eaten twice the number of meagre potted meat sandwiches provided. The sister lucidly and emphatically explained to us that she had no idea what people were thinking about to send out such girls as we, girls who had not come from any training school, girls who had not had any hospital training. What use could we possibly be? Luckily, she does go on to add that within a month or so, this sister had become a good friend and there developed a mutual liking and respect. And Vera Britton, while working at number 24 General Hospital in Étaples, wrote with emotion of her experiences nursing the sick and dying of the war. Some of her writing is now very familiar to many people. And she wrote in late 1917, "The fighting is continuing very long this year, and the convoys keep coming down 2 or 3 a night. We have heaps of gas cases here at present. There are 10 in this ward alone. I wish those people who write so glibly about this being a holy war could see a case, to say nothing of 10 cases of mustard gas in its early stages, could see the poor things burnt and blistered all over, with great mustard-coloured suppurating blisters, with blind eyes all sticky and stuck together, and always fighting for breath, with voices a mere whisper, saying that their throats are closing, and they know that they will choke." Vera Britton, one of the most well-known nurses of the Great War, gave up her life as a student here in Oxford to become a VAD. She has become an iconic figure, and it seems sometimes she's seen as almost the sole representative of Great War nurses, but in fact she was just one of thousands of well-bred, educated young women whose experiences were often very similar and whose lives should never have been touched by mustard gas and gangrene. One nurse's diary published just last month was kept by this lady, Edith Appleton, and she was an experienced trained nurse. She trained at St Bartholomew's Hospital in London, and in her diary she gives a wonderful description of the VAD she worked with in France, perceptive and humorous. In November 1915, she was working at number 3 General Hospital at Le Tréport, and VADs were very new in her hospital. They had come out slowly, filtered into the hospitals, and at number 3 General, they were still quite a novelty. She writes, "The VADs are a source of great interest to me. Taking them as a bunch, they are splendid. They may be roughly divided into 4 sorts: stalkers, crawlers, the irresponsible butterflies, and the sturdy pushers. At the moment, I'm thinking of a butterfly who's on night duty in these wards, and she says with a light-hearted laugh, 'It's ripping nursing the men, great fun. When I was in the officers' ward, I did housework all the time, great fun, but there the men are really ill, great fun.' When I show her how to do anything fresh, she twitches to get at it and says, 'Oh, do let me try. I'd love to do that, simply love to.' She's an aristocratic little person, most dainty and well-groomed, and the thought of her doing scrubbing and dusting all day makes me smile. The stalkers are nice girls, very lordly with high-pitched, cracky voices. They look rather alarmed at some of the jobs they have to do, but they do them well and with good grace. By crawlers, I mean the little people with their hair done up at the back who think they're unworthy to do anything at all, with an expression of, 'Stand on me if you like, I should be pleased to be your doormat.' There's little to say about the sturdy pusher ones. They're not remarkable for anything, but are quite reliable, very strong, never forget, and are always ready to do every bit of work." In France, discipline was tight, with nurses not being allowed any social interaction with men, except that approved and chaperoned by their matron or other senior nurse. There were many occasions when women were disciplined after attending dances or were seen walking out with soldiers. The usual punishment was usually either to be asked to resign or to transfer back to a home hospital in disgrace. But if you were a VAD and you did want to sin, better to choose your time and place carefully. In January 1917, Rachel Crowdy, who was the principal commandant of VADs in France, was at dinner in a hotel in Rouen when she saw 2 VADs in the same hotel dining room. Maud McCarthy, the matron-in-chief in France, relates in her war diary, letter received from Miss Crowdy reporting that she had seen Mrs. Lloyd, VAD, not dressed in proper uniform and dining out with another VAD and 2 officers and behaving in a very unladylike manner. She had on a pale pink blouse and a collarette of pearls and went out into the street smoking. Her behavior was such that Colonel Stewart and Colonel Pasteur, who were dining with Miss Crowdy, would not even allow her to go and ask the ladies who they were. The result of this excursion was that Mrs. Lloyd was advised to tender her resignation, and we have to note that while it was fine for Miss Crowdy to dine out with 2 officers, Mrs. Lloyd was committing a sin worthy of dismissal. With so much talk today of VADs engaged in nursing duties, it mustn't be forgotten that their contribution went far beyond nursing. The formation of the VAD General Service Section in 1917 saw many thousands of women taking over the jobs previously done by men in military hospitals in order to release them for military service. And they worked as dispensers, orderlies, clerks, cooks, servants, storewomen, and drivers. It's not often that images are seen of VADs doing anything else other than nursing, but just to go through a few of them. These photos, the one of Boulogne and these next few, were all taken after the Armistice. In February 1919, Priscilla Lady Norman was sent out to France with Agnes Conway and Norfolk photographer Olive Edith on behalf of the Imperial War Museum to take a photographic archive of women's work in France, that being thought the first opportunity that it could be done. Olive Edith's photos, her collection, are now at the IWM. And this first one is of VADs serving a meal in a sister's mess in Etaples. Nursing VADs, as well as general service VADs, had to take a turn in doing mess duties, in helping home sister general duties in the mess. Many of them hated it and would rather be on the wards, but some of them, particularly some of the older women, quite liked it. But doing duties as cooks or helping with meals was something they did quite regularly. Here, a group of VAD clerks, typists, telephonists. This is in the matron-in-chief's office in Boulogne, again after the Armistice. When the matron-in-chief went out to France in August 1914, she went out alone. Within a few days, she had taken on this nursing sister, a woman called Isabelle Barbier, a French national trained as a nurse in England. And with Isabelle Barbier, she worked for a while, she needed more clerical staff, and she had a good way of getting them. She used to scour the lists of nursing VADs going out to France. She would look to see what their previous jobs had been, and if she found any secretaries or clerks, she would bring them into her office. They thought they were going to nurse. She decided they would come to work for her in secretarial posts. And she built up a very loyal, long-serving staff. By this time, by the Armistice, she had a staff, Miss Barbier is still with her, and she had a staff of 16. And then, again, a post-war shot of the British Red Cross ambulance depot in Boulogne. All these VAD drivers lined up next to their vehicles. I'm sure they never looked like that in wartime. And that same group of women looking very happy and relaxed, probably with all the pressures of war taken off them. And the VAD ambulance drivers were possibly doing the most arduous, potentially dangerous of all VAD work. Of 15 military medals awarded to VADs during the war, 5 were to drivers, 4 of those for one incident in France in July 1918. The citation reading, for conspicuous devotion to duty during a hostile air raid, all these lady drivers were out with their cars during the raid, picking up and in every way assisting the wounded and injured, and showed great bravery and coolness, and were an example to all ranks. They also carried to safety and helped in every way many French civilians. And there were many VADs and Red Cross helpers who never went overseas, never entered a hospital, never nursed a soldier, but they were still essential. And those were the women who staffed the war hospital supply depots in the UK, rolling bandages, padding splints, preparing dressings, packing boxes of comforts to be sent to Red Cross hospitals everywhere. And there were nearly 3,000 war hospital supply depots and work parties throughout the UK and abroad. This is Barnard Davis's painting of Gerrards Cross War Hospital Supply Depot, Gerrards Cross in Buckinghamshire. And this is a very beautiful honey-coloured glow. It's a bit like a sort of a cappuccino of nurses with this sort of muslin top. And they're here, they're doing all the things they did. They're making many-tailed bandages, abdominal binders, roller bandages, all sorts of work going on. And you can look at that and think, you know, was life really like that, and how much artistic license was used? I recently came across some photos very local to me, including this one, which is Hove, Sussex War Hospital Supply Depot. And exactly the same is going on. It hasn't got the honey-coloured glow, but those women are doing exactly the same tasks as Barnard Davis portrayed. And this was going on somewhere near you. It was going on everywhere in the country. It can't be denied that there were difficulties surrounding VADs during the Great War. In the early days, there was friction between them and the trained nursing staff. There was ongoing criticism from the professional nursing press, who always saw them as a threat to the trained nurse. They sometimes found their own surroundings uncongenial and unwelcoming. But they were versatile, willing, self-sacrificing, with a deep sense of patriotism and a range of life skills and experience not usually seen in military hospitals. And they found comradeship, independence, and a freedom that they had never grown up to expect, but which changed their lives forever. And as they waited and prepared to go overseas, most VADs would have read and been inspired by those words of their Commandant-in-Chief that we heard earlier, urging them to do their duty loyally. On the back of that message was a prayer specially written for them. It read, "Teach us no task can be too great, no work too small, for those who die or suffer pain for us and their country. Give unto those who rule a gentle justice and a wisely guiding hand, remembering, blessed are the merciful. And when peace comes, grant neither deed nor word of ours has thrown a shadow on the cross, nor stained the flag of England." And I think it was mission accomplished. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.